When I look at the collective human species, I think that we are probably doing somewhere close to the worst that we can actually be doing for the planet and for future generations. When I look across the spectrum of how we are educating youth, when I look across the spectrum of how we are caring for our environment, when I look across the spectrum of lifestyle choices that we are making in general, I don't think we're that far off from like, being on, if there was a spectrum of how we can optimize for a great climate future and a great future for generations to come and how we can optimize for a worse future, I feel like we're more on the side of the worse when I look collectively.
And at what point did we start doing this? Is it, we talk about the Industrial Revolution. I mean, like, what was the thing that is the catalyst to this happening in the first place?
Yeah, the way that I see it is that a lot of what we're doing are embedded behaviors and programs that have existed for some centuries and maybe even before that. And it's a factor of the advancement of technology and the tools that we have that is amplifying the impact. Right. But I feel like it's not that we had some major collective psychological and sociological shifts that now got us into like destroying the planet and doing this and doing that. I feel like it stemmed from I mean the man, I feel like this is so cliche, but I feel like like when I think about it, it's the economic system that governs things. Like even the way classrooms were designed, it was designed during the Industrial Revolution with the intention to produce more factory workers, right? And a lot of the environmental impact that is happening, the environmental degradation, it's not led by individual consumers like you and I, is actually led by larger organizations that are looking to extract a higher profit margin from their operations. So I think a lot of it actually tracks back to this underlying economic paradigm that we have. And maybe that economic paradigm tracks back to some innate like survival instinct thing. And maybe this is just our survival instincts on steroids,
I
where
do,
it's like,
I do believe if we didn't have the ability to build companies, we would be going to war with each other. I feel like capitalism is the new way that we as animals take over and create status in the world. I think that's why in the medieval times you'd fight for land, you'd fight for prestige. Why don't we do that anymore? It's because we have capitalism. We have other ways to fight on an even playing field without it being necessary to go kill each other, take over a castle. So there's something inherent to it. Because before we had capitalism, you had people going to war and just fucking each other up over what? In the name of certain flags of certain houses of royalty, right? New royalty is just who can afford the nicest apartment, the top tower in New York City. So the game hasn't changed; it's just evolved, and it's evolved through capitalism being the lens.
yeah, totally. And I don't necessarily, I think that there are immense pros and cons to modern day capitalism. I don't think that it's all bad. I don't think that it's all atrocious by any means. I feel like it's a good experiment in how we form an economic system. And I actually think it's been a catalyst for some incredible innovation that we have today. Right? I do believe that this economic paradigm of capitalism does promote innovation in a way that maybe other ways of thinking and organizing do not. So I don't think it's all doom and gloom with
I,
capitalism.
my favorite example of this is the pencil problem. Chris Dixon, he came up with this concept. If you did not have capitalism, do you know how hard it would be to make a pencil? You think about going and chopping down wood, chopping down that wood up into small bits, be able to compress it, finding lead, mining the lead, finding the metal tip in the rubber. It would take you months to create a pencil without capitalism, right? Like it would be infeasible. So there is a lot of innovation that comes from it, even the technology we're looking at. And I guess where my mind goes, like, how do you leverage a capital system in order to make it more in tune with the planet? Like, let's just assume that capitalism continues because for all that we know, it will. I mean, it's just the way we exchange things nowadays, right? So how do you evolve the system so that it nudges the world in a direction that can be more holistic for the planet?
Yeah. And I think that, underneath the idea of capitalism, it really tracks back to human motivation, right? And when you think about capitalism, a system that is optimizing for generating capital, generating a profit, that is our current way of meeting our needs, our basic human needs, like food, like shelter, right? It's less and less common that we're actually going out and hunting for food and going out and building our own homes. And instead, we are using this means of exchange, which is money, to get those things. And capitalism is a way for people to be intentional about generating that capital to meet their basic human needs. And so I think that ultimately it tracks back to motivation and incentives. And I think that's a good question that you pose, and I'm down to riff on that. I feel like that's a good one, good direction to take it in.
Yeah, I mean, the first thing that comes to mind for me is responsibility and accountability. Every time I open up Amazon to do some shopping, it blows my mind how much shit exists. The fact that you can buy a product, most of it made out of plastic and at industrial level for every single individual use case, whatever your needs and desires might be, is fucking insane. The fact that a lot of those things that you see that are just junk, right? They might have one individual use, have 200,000 units of it in the world. That's 200,000 pieces of material from the earth that will never come back. And people talk about recycling, but the dirty truth of recycling is most of the shit that's recycled actually does not work. So there's only a certain number of times a material can be recycled that it can even be usable another time through. So I think it's just weird that everything exists. And I always think to myself, why do we not hold the people producing these objects responsible for the proper disposal, or have taxes associated with the production of each individual unit? The first thing that comes to mind is Coca-Cola, right? They're not being taxed for all the bottles that they are producing. Hundreds of thousands of plastic bottles, non-renewable per hour, all right? And they're not being taxed and or held responsible for the collecting of that material. I feel that a first no-brainer would be to disincentivize production of mass material goods, and at the very least hold these companies as responsible for their carbon footprint. And now we have the technology to do so. One of the interesting things that's happened in the last 2 weeks, most people are probably unaware of, is that Nike now issues an NFT for every single pair of their shoes that are produced. So they have a formal tracking system that tracks every single pair of sneakers that goes out into the world. That same system can be applied to any mass produced object, any product, physical product that uses earth based materials that goes into the market. So I feel like, the first step would be bringing these companies and holding them accountable for the shit that they produce. And obviously, this is easy for us to say because we're in technology, right? We're not producing that much of a carbon footprint. Our products are digital and they go into your ears and they go into your phones. But I feel that addressing that directly and using the capitalistic system in order to disincentivize production, or at the very least hold these companies responsible, would be a step in the right direction.
Yeah, and what comes up for me when you say that is this month's theme of being a good ancestor and thinking about that in the context of corporate responsibility or organizational responsibility. And what you're naming about producing all these single use plastics and what we're experiencing on planet Earth of species literally disappearing from the face of the earth that may never come back into existence because of these decisions that we're making, like that is the essence of our legacy and the role that we play as ancestors. And when you talk about accountability for companies, what comes to mind is all of these different promises that organizations make of reducing their carbon footprint or of doing we're going to be zero, we're going to be zero impact by 2030 and all of these like arbitrary timelines and goals. But I don't really see companies sticking to those and government sticking to those, right? When you look at like these big meetings and gatherings where all the nations come together and try to agree on things and agree to keep emissions below certain levels, they just blow through it. Like we're just blow through it, and there's no accountability for blowing through those things. And one thing that comes up for me is thinking about social accountability and thinking about how we might be able to collectively see all the promises that these organizations are making and be able to track those and be able to view their progress with that. And I feel like that information needs to be made more available to the consumer to be able to make more informed purchasing decisions. Right? If that information was available to know that X, Y, and Z company are not actually on track to meet their sustainability goals, I feel like that allows people to make more informed decisions about which companies they'll support.
And I think you're touching on something else, which is leveraging the technology available to us to hold people accountable. This is the same thing with like nuclear bombs. You know why a nuclear bomb's not going to drop? Because the person, the leader of that country, will be held accountable, right? Like there is a person behind that decision, making the decision to drop that, make that decision to basically reopen that chapter of human history. With that said, when it comes to plastic production, it's very anonymous. Who is responsible for the plastic production? Right? Like literally since the conversation started, we've printed and created probably over 1 million plastic bottles. New plastic bottles, right? Who is responsible for those decisions? Right? And maybe there is something to holding those individuals accountable for the production of that plastic.
Yes, I agree. And we just have no collective self-control because now those plastics are making their way into the ocean and making their way into the fish, and we are literally eating the plastic, right? And we don't give a shit. It's like it's still it's still happening. The bottles are still being produced, they're still being put into the ocean, and then we're literally toxifying ourselves through the food that we're eating because of these decisions that are being made. And I'm just sitting with this idea of corporate social responsibility and just that notion, right, of the social responsibility of a corporation. And right now, how that is viewed is as a singular department within a big organization. I was like, oh, CSR. It's like, how can you possibly have a CSR department and still be producing X amount of single use plastic bottles per hour? How can those two things coexist?
Well, this is the weird part, right? Like if we were to go extinct today and the millions of years and from now a alien civilization rocked up the planet Earth, they would find nothing. But you know what they would find? Plastic. That would be
Yeah,
our legacy, would be the plastic that we produced. Pretty much it. Everything else would be
yeah,
wiped out and the plastic will still persevere. And then also some nuclear waste. I think that's a different discussion. The other thing that comes up is like the word social, like making it's such a soft word to a lot of people. Oh,
mm,
you're a social worker. It's like social impact, right? And it's kind of like to people who are in business, right? It's a social initiative, right? Like why do we classify things this way? And why don't we give more prestige to I mean, maybe social is just the wrong word. I think it could also be a branding problem, right? We could also call it extinction, like the anti-extinction initiatives of this company,
right.
right? And actually call it what it is, which is us slowly eating ourselves alive because this is our spaceship, right? Like every resource that's extracted from it, it's one less resource that the planet can produce, right? We're eating it alive, and then in the name of some things that have not been critically thought about and proper strategies put in place to mitigate the risk that we pose to ourselves.
Yeah, I was watching a documentary maybe like a month ago about billionaires that are building bunkers, like doomsday bunkers, which what comes up for me when watching that is that's, instead of actually changing our practices and looking to create a good legacy and create a better and more prosperous future for coming generations, we are instead choosing to figure out an escape plan.
It's not a bad hedge. I mean, frankly, living in LA in the middle of COVID and seeing what the fuck went down, when you had over 10 million people protesting, and I'm not saying it was wrong. Like, these people had a right to do what they do, and frankly, nothing else was working. But witnessing that firsthand, I mean, literally on my street, people going and burning shit down, breaking into every storefront. There's people out at 5 in the morning just doing hood rat shit, like with fucking letting off fireworks and all this crazy shit. Like, I was thinking the same thing, man. Like, I took my girlfriend, I went over to Topanga and got the fuck out of there because it really felt like the end of society. I mean, if you see these things on a daily basis and you have the means, I see no reason why you wouldn't at least consider having that hedge against what could potentially happen, frankly. I mean, this is why I'm personally looking at land in the Azores Islands. I know that you are looking at land in Costa Rica. Like, it's not that crazy to think. And if you have the means in order to set yourself up for that worst case scenario, I don't see why you wouldn't. And just like, have a multi generational strategy should shit hit the fan.
Well, I think that it's an escapist approach, and I think to me, what those actions are saying is instead of actually addressing the challenges that exist, I'm going to figure out a way that I'm good, regardless of what happens to everyone else. That's kind of how I see it.
Yeah, you can do both. Like I don't need to go live on the streets of Detroit to make an impact. That's just my 2 cents on it. Like, if I have the means to not be in that sort of situation or to set my family up, because it's still, there's still something to that tribe level. I mean, like that inner circle. There is an inherent human instinct to protect your children before you protect somebody else's. I wish it was not that way. I wish we could see everybody as brothers, sisters, mothers, daughters, and children. But I do believe there is an inherent instinct to do that, and I frankly don't blame them. If I was in that position, I would both have a bunker and some land in the Azores Islands, probably a bunker in the Azores Islands, and I would be helping fix the problem. I don't think it's one
Totally,
without the other, in my opinion.
totally.
Yeah. So one idea I want to throw out there is like, plastic is, it looks great. Like, you ever notice that? Like, you look at like a nice plastic bottle, it's fucking clear and like super nice to look at and like really pleasing to the eye. One idea I had was, why don't we make it law to make plastic as ugly as humanly possible? Like, actually inject the plastic with like brown and purple and grotesque colors to make it as displeasing to the eye as possible. This is something that you see in a lot of Asian countries with cigarettes. They actually have pictures of, on the cigarette cartridge, of like what happens to your teeth and to your body in the event that you actually consume the cigarettes. And maybe we could take a similar approach with plastic water bottles, right? Where on the actual front facing of the bottles, maybe it shows a picture of planet Earth in disarray, right? Or a turtle with a freaking ring straps around his neck, right? And it actually shows the consequences of the plastic on the bottle itself. So you don't get this like pretty, beautiful branded experience. It's like, no, you're literally destroying the planet. We make people cognizant of that. I think there was a significant drop off in smokers due to this effort in some Asian countries when they implemented this practice.
Yeah, that makes total sense. What I put together from that is matching the sensory experience with the impact of it. Right. So if it is kind of a negative environmental impact, how do you make the sensory experience of that thing be something undesirable for folks? Right. And disincentivizing for people to engage with. And I feel like
Oh,
that kind of leads down a whole track of different thought experiments.
yeah. I mean, imagine somebody walking around with a water bottle that's depicting like, animals and fish dying, right? Or when you go to like the oil pump to fill up your gasoline tank, it's like you see a little baby duck that's covered in oil, right? Like anything that has a net negative effect on the planet, actually showing that because we're so far removed from it, right? When you consume, like you go to the store, you buy a nice bottle of water, you drown it. It's like maybe got some lemon flavoring to it and toss it into the trash. You don't see the consequences of the action. You don't feel it. And you are literally 15 degrees removed from the consequences by design, right? Versus having these sort of images, which would pretty much blanket society. Like, I mean, if you actually took that approach, it would probably be on, I mean, every single piece of plastic would have an image of what the consequences are of this action. And my belief would be that people's behaviors would change,
Hmm.
right? It's very hard to ignore when it's looking in the eye. Like I had a great experience last week. I did the visuals at this incredible festival called Soulfest here in Portugal. And you had this massive projector, and the final night, it was like grounding night. I put on all these nature documentaries. And it was just images, and there's an interesting effect where all the kids were sitting in front of the projector watching the movies. So I got to know this one kid really well. We sat there watching nature docos for a couple hours. And the nature documentary showed polar bears and the destruction of the Arctic due to climate change. And he asked me, he's like, why is that happening? And I did my best to explain to him like why the polar ice caps are melting. And he asked me, he's like, well, if all the polar ice caps are gone, where are the polar bears going to live? And I'm like, that's a very good question. And, I feel like you don't really conceptualize it, until you're sitting with somebody of the younger generation who's asking those sort of questions. You don't really have that exposure, even as a kid, to the consequences of the environmental damage that's happening in the world unless you're in that specific situation. So to blanket our plastic and all these degrading things that we choose to partake in, I feel like would make people much, much more cognizant of the choices that they make. It would signal something. That's the big difference, right? When you have a water bottle that literally shows a turtle being chokeholded by some plastic and you're walking around with that, it signals something to other people that you're not doing this from a place of consciousness. Now we can talk all about equality and access and food access and all that stuff, but I think it's a little bit different conversation.
Yeah, totally. And I see there are different stakeholders that play different roles along different points in the supply chain, right? I think on one hand, you have the government, and that government can make policy changes, right? So, like what you're saying earlier around disincentivizing the production and manufacturing of some of these things, that's something the government can do, right? Is regulation and policy. So that's one stakeholder and one form of action. Another one is companies, and they can make changes to their practices, right? Actually make changes to how they operate and what their practices are. And then you have the consumer, which the consumer can make changes to their purchasing behaviors and to their behaviors in general to support a better outcome for the environment. And then the last stakeholder, I think, is the post-consumer stakeholder, which is actually the material management providers, and the changes that they can make is technological innovation, right? How do we actually create and scale the right technologies that can process waste and or process material and reuse that for, be able to reuse that and repurpose that. So there are these different stakeholders that all have different roles that they can play. And I feel like a lot of the responsibility, a lot of the media attention is really put on the consumer piece, and really around, it's a lot pushing for the individuals to make better choices. But I see those different stakeholders all having autonomy and being able to make choices. And I feel like zooming in on which one of those is the highest impact and which one of those is the most feasible to change is probably a good place to start when thinking about, how we might be able to leverage capitalism to actually propel us to a better environmental future.
Well, if you like, obviously focus on archetypes is what we have to deal with, but I think there's also this higher structure, which is It's very weird that we have countries. Like, if you think about it, right? Like, we're talking about the death and destruction of planet Earth, right? Everything is contingent on planet Earth surviving, right? And the fact that we cannot coordinate cross nation, that is the container of which any laws are made, and that there is no ability to coordinate cross nation. The United Nations, it does some stuff, but it can't do much in this area. You can have goals, you can have peace treaties signed, but everything pretty much comes down to who can enforce the military in a specific zone. So, I feel like, we're looking at the picture of Earth in a very fucked up lens. And a part of me wishes, and this will probably happen within our lifetime. This is a big claim. Part of me wishes that aliens touch down and make themselves known to us, because pretty quickly, once this happens, it will transition from being North Korean, American, South African into being human. And we need this shift to happen. Like, we need to start seeing ourselves as all members of a international human tribe, right? Removing the nation states is a restriction in order to see what we're doing at the macro level. If that doesn't happen, I fear that we might never get there, because even within the, this container we just described of government, corporation, consumer, post-consumer, even if that is 100% effective, I mean, if tomorrow Sweden figures all their shit out, and if somebody was to figure all their shit out, it would be China. A lot of people don't realize how quickly they can move given the society that they built. But let's suppose China figures everything out. What difference does it make? It's only 1/7 of the planet, right? So you're still restricted by all these nation states and boundaries and laws that would also permeate the other 6/7 of planet Earth, right? And now China's in a position where they solve their problems, they can't produce as much, right? And they lose at the world economic system. So there's also this sort of need of us rising above the nation state and kind of looking at the macro picture and waking up to the fact that this is a shared collective experience. This is not Ukraine versus Russia, America versus Mexico, all these other nation states. It's us. And there's only one planet, one spaceship.
Yeah, and to break that down even further to first principles, like nations are lines drawn on a map. They're lines drawn on a map hundreds of years ago that we take as absolute truth, and we formed governments around these lines on a map. But really, when you break it down, there's no physical line, there's no physical border. I guess maybe now there is when Donald Trump built that wall. But, in most cases, there's no actual physical border. These borders are imaginary and they're fictitious. They're just ideas that we adhere to, right? That this is a nation. And that's an ideology, that this is the United States and this is America. That's purely an ideology. And one thing I'm curious to know a little bit more about from you is network states and what that term means to you. What do you know about it? How do you see that playing into this conversation?
Yes, the network state is the next stage of evolution for us as a species when it comes to coordinating. So right now we have nation states, right? Like, you are American, I am Israeli, I am this, I am that. Versus network states, which we've gotten to the point in our technological history where we have a viable alternative to everything a state provides. Using technology, we can have voting systems. Using technology, we can actually raise funding. Also, using technology, as of about a decade ago, we can launch our own currency. So, if you actually break down the fundamentals of what a state provides, which are voting capacity, protection, as well as currency, we can basically replace all these core components with technology. And actually, today, like, if you and I, within the next half hour, wanted to launch our own currency called Mantra Coin, we could do it. Right? If we wanted to set up a voting panel and introduce all of our friends to it so that we vote on issues together, we can do that too. Right? So a lot of the core infrastructure that used to make up the nation state can now be replicated by anybody on earth with technology. So what could this possibly lead to is having small groups of people that are from different nations, decentralized, coordinating in very interesting ways. In fact, you have entire things called DAOs, decentralized autonomous organizations, that operate anonymously. So you literally have these organizations of hundreds to thousands of people that are all coordinating with it among themselves, and they don't know each other's names. They don't need to, because the technology has gotten to the point where we can actually exchange value, we can vote on things, and we can make cross functional decisions without the need to actually know other people. That's the same way in a voting system. You just know you have trust in a government that when you vote, that vote is counted and put towards something. You have trust that your tax dollars go to the right places. Nowadays, we can actually prove that with code. So when I vote on an issue, I can see the vote up on the interface and on the blockchain, which is just a way of tracking things. It's like a spreadsheet that can't be faked. Same thing with my money. So if I send money to a certain place, I can see the specific areas where that money has gone indefinitely. You don't have that same ability with government. If you vote on something, you are trusting the government counting system that the vote's going to where it should be. Same thing with your tax dollars, right? You have no guarantee that the money that you are spending and sending the government is going to the right places. With these network states and the technology that can back them, it is a very different situation where definitively that's where the money is going. So basically, we've gotten to the point in history that if you're a little bit tech savvy, and today you need to be tech savvy to do this, but in 5 years you won't have to be, where you can literally spin up all the same functionality that a government would provide in a matter of hours. In the future, it'll be a matter of minutes. You will literally be able to open up an interface and launch effectively all the core components of what makes up a nation state on the internet and allow anonymous individuals to interact with it. And I feel like this could be a way to solve some of these fundamental issues. Like if I wanted to, like within Lisbon, we have about 500,000 people. If I wanted to coordinate all the individuals here in order to, hold ecstatic dances, I could do it through this sort of system where we raise money to pay for venues, where we have voting on, what the sets are and the music that's being played. And what we're basically doing is creating a small network state. It's a network of people that are positioned to create a coordination at scale. So the network state also in this book by Bajali, I highly encourage you to read it, lays out the plan for taking network states and actually turning them into nation states as well. Right? Like what are the actual laws that would constitute a nation state that has literal recognition from the international community for being a legitimate organization? That's the other interesting evolution of this, where once we have all these components set up, you have taxation in place, you have citizenship on a digital level, like actually becoming your own nation itself, which is the next evolution in this.
Yeah, thank you for that. One idea within that is the potential for like citizen governance and not needing to rely on a government to actually govern a system. And what I think about when you were sharing that is what you shared earlier about Nike producing and minting an NFT for every pair of sneakers they produce. And that concept of a digital twin, right? For every physical product that is produced, there is a digital twin that is now on chain, that is time stamped and immutable, and it's there.
And
And
just to
think,
break down those concepts, though, because I think there's a lot of big words that were just thrown around.
totally.
Like when we're talking about digital twin, what we're saying is that there is a record that exists of the purchase of the shoe, which does exist today. It's in the form of a receipt. That receipt is probably in your local shoe source database, and also there's some record of Nike selling that receipt. Versus when they have a tokenized version of it, every single person across the entire world can actually verify that that shoe exists and it was sold to that person. So it is a way globally to track who owns what shoe, when that shoe was produced, when it was sold, what the materials are made on it, and a bunch of other information as to the makeup of that shoe. So what we're doing is taking the information that used to be reserved for proprietary corporation or government databases and bringing it out into the open for everyone to verify. And that's the important part, that everybody can verify, not just the corporation, not just the government who can fudge the numbers, but globally, we know exactly how many Nike shoes are produced, who owns them, what the production costs were, and can actually understand this is the total number of Nike shoes available out in the world. This is the beginning of that possibility, knowing the precise number of Nike shoes ever produced at a global level.
And so to bring that back to the idea that you shared earlier around accountability, I feel like there's a clear linkage there between, the example of what Nike is doing and just different ways that we might be able to hold organizations accountable for the actions that they take. And as I was talking about before, these commitments that organizations make, what if those commitments were on chain and actually publicly viewable and publicly available for when those commitments are made? They're time stamped, they're non changeable, they're there. And if there's also a system in place that is creating a non changeable digital record that is public of every shoe produced, that creates a publicly viewable way for people to see if organizations are acting in accordance with their commitments. And not only that, with smart contracts, you can actually program this in a way where companies are penalized if they do not meet those commitments. And so that's something that comes up with bringing this all together as you're talking about network states, talking about Nike's new way of tracking shoes, and also talking about accountability. I feel like there's an intersectionality there for how we hold the organizations accountable for their environmental impact.
If you wanted to be a real mover as a nation state, and I'm looking like when I think of this, I think of Singapore. That's the first one that really comes to mind. I would require every single product that's being sold in my nation to be trackable on chain. It's an effort, right? But right now you have all these different ERP systems, and it's just like ERP basically means like how you track your production as a company, right? And there's actually specifically one company that owns the vast majority of the market share called SAP. Nobody's really heard of it, right? Multi-hundred billion dollar company. Nobody really knows about it, but they basically created the structure for tracking things internally. And I'm not going to go too deep into that. But if you wanted to be a first mover on this, you could actually introduce legislation that requires every company to do what Nike did. Every single piece of physical and saleable infrastructure or product that is produced, require them to track it on chain. It would not only allow consumers to see overall production, right? Not only at the level of the corporation, but all corporations. You could literally see how many sweatshirts, t-shirts, whatever were produced today, but also it would help with taxation, right? If there was a requirement to have a digital twin of that whatever product is produced and tracked and sold, it could also give us a sense of what sort of materials we're using on a daily basis, a much better sense of what sort of materials we are choosing to extract from the earth. And if you're a consumer who once on purchase of those specific assets, you could actually track, in theory, if every corporation is doing this, precisely how much materials you have consumed this year. How much plastic have you consumed? How much meat have you consumed? What is your genuine environmental impact? This technology, if it was brought to the legislation level and enforced upon corporations, could, in theory, give us the information we need to make not only better informed decisions, but better taxation for governments. It would also provide us with the context to, really reinvent how we see ourselves as consumers and really make corporations think twice about producing an additional unit.
Mm,
The waste would be known.
yeah,
The waste would be known from a corporation level and production that people could see, and the waste would be known as to how much you are consuming as the consumer.
Yeah, and with that model, let's just this Nike example, I feel like is a good thing to riff on. So if there was a way to actually know the materials that are used to create that shoe, the water that was used to make that shoe, the emissions from the factory used to make that shoe, if those are metrics that are available, that maybe that's attached in the metadata of the NFT of the shoe produced. This is a way, two big benefits of that, right? One big benefit is informed economic participation. And what I mean by that is that the consumer has this publicly available information and they are making more informed purchasing decisions Because right now, you go to the shoe store, you buy Nike, you have no clue what the impact of that shoe is, because that information is not publicly available, and that information may not be tracked. I imagine Nike's tracking that information, but it's not available to people on a real-time basis. So that's one benefit, is this informed economic participation. I think another benefit is the ability to penalize organizations not meeting their commitments. If all of this is being tracked on chain, I think there are ways to programmatically penalize organizations who don't meet those commitments. And maybe that penalty is whatever locked up funds there are for the duration of this commitment. Maybe if that commitment's not met, maybe that goes towards regenerating the forest, or maybe that goes towards whatever. But I feel like,
One thing that comes up is, if you could, this is the interesting part about this programmable money, right? Like in theory, what you could do if you really wanted to make a commitment is an organization, right? Like suppose, just use Nike because we know we're doing it on chain. If they said, hey, we're going to reduce our carbon footprint by 20% less plastic used in shoes, for example, right? And they were to actually lock up capital. This is what you can do with smart contracts, like actually put, I don't know, $20 million into a smart contract, which for everyone who doesn't know, smart contract is just a way to pre-program money. So today, I, for example, could launch a smart contract and Nick could lock up $10,000 for his future children in 50 years, and there would be no way for me to touch it. It's actually a pretty simple program relative to most things that happen in blockchain. So we could have a corporate challenge that they lock up capital in order to hit their goals. And if it's not provable on chain, they lose the money and it goes towards the World Wildlife Federation, or it goes towards a fund for whatever sort of cause would basically be the anti to make up for that lack of corporate responsibilities. It really is a function of putting your money where your mouth is, right? And locking those things up on chain. Now, another interesting thing you could do, all right, is within the same sort of challenges is we could actually, like Nike today, could create a fund where people who own Nike shoes, right, submit a picture with their receipt, with their box, with the general dated purchase, and then create an NFT for existing shoes to better track the waste that's already been produced. In exchange for that, they would then get some sort of monetary incentive. So that same money that was locked up, if they don't hit the goals, can also be paid out to people who choose to share their information, right? There's also ways for people to become more informed and participate in understanding what the carbon footprint of the shoes are, bring it on chain, and begin the process of tracking the things that we own. There really should be, now that I'm thinking about it, a way for most corporations for people to participate and understand, like retroactively, right, what sort of impact that the things that they've bought have on the environment. And it's feasible. Like we're at the point in history where that whole scenario, both these scenarios I've laid out are perfectly possible.
yeah, totally. And what it also provides is historical public data. When we think about being a good ancestor, both as someone who might be an executive at one of these organizations, as well as someone who may be a consumer of Nike shoes, this creates public historical data where we can actually look at a data set over time and what commitments were met or were not met over time. Because I think one of the big things that plague us currently is short-term thinking and short-sighted thinking. And that's the incredible thing about these blockchain networks, is that once they're running, they're going to be around as long as there is a single computer running an instance of that blockchain, right? And so having this long lasting network, this long lasting ledger of all these transactions that are publicly available, just gives us that long term thinking by default and allows us to make decisions based on public historical data, which is now currently locked up in companies' servers somewhere.
Yeah, and just to like elaborate on what that means, like a blockchain is like pretty much if you were just some rogue individual with a computer in their basement and you chose to support that network, it would still exist in perpetuity until the end of time. This is what the decentralized component means. So it's not up to Nike to just delete records. In fact, I guarantee Nike's probably lost millions and millions of records over the course of its history, right? With a blockchain technology, everything is out in the open, everyone can access it, and then everybody can also support it. Should we feel that that information and that tracking still is valid. Now, you would have an interesting challenge of, even when it comes to tracking these sort of strategies by Nike, verifying the data. All these things come down to verification, agreeing that Nike saying that this pair of shoes has, 8 grams of plastic versus the other one having 15 grams of plastic is universally agreed upon.
That's the trickiest part of this whole model. And right now it seems like that is probably a human verified process, of someone that's on site actually clocking or logging these numbers of what it takes to produce a shoe. But I think that's the big gap currently in this potential system of holding
You know what
companies
I would
accountable.
do? I would create a, I mean, DAO is a big word, but just like, I would actually have each corporation's competitors doing the measuring. Like, I would have like Yeezy or Kanye West doing the measuring on the Nike shoes that roll out, right? Or have like somebody responsible whose direct interest is in screwing over the other company, like a non-neutral party, the one who's responsible for verifying that information is actually correct, right? Or some of these like world conservation conservative networks. And this is the beauty of this sort of the structure, right? You can actually allocate capital into these contracts or into these accounts that account for compensating those who are responsible for measurement, right? And the other interesting thing is, like, you don't have the existential risk of funding being pulled, right? If it's done correctly, right? That money exists in perpetuity until the end of the smart contract, meaning the end of when the money is either given back to Nike or it's paid out to the charity, right? So you can set it up so that the precise distribution of all funds over the course of that smart contract's history, and over the course of the effort.
Totally. It almost seems like there could be a version of this where each commitment kind of spins off its own decentralized autonomous organization, where those funds are actually used to compensate auditors or verifiers, maybe third party environmental organizations, to actually be on site and maybe measuring these, tracking these, making sure that the numbers that are being reported are actually accurate.
Yes, in theory, that once one of these decisions gets propagated, meaning propagated, mean like launched out into the public, you could, in theory, spin up a whole organization and money that's being put at stake, like publicly staked money that guarantees the follow through on this decision. And maybe that's a very, I mean, we talk about socially responsible companies. That would be the way to do it. It's actually putting the money where the mouth is, and again, integrating capitalism into the accountability of these decisions. The technology exists to do this. I think it comes down to verification and measurement. The also weird thing I saw recently is like the concept of a private company oriented blockchain. It's a company called Secret, which isn't great. Like, it's necessary in some circumstances. Obviously, not all information should be public, but it kind of also is like, oof, you're going to have private blockchains as well. That would constitute to me a much more socially responsible organization doing things in the open. So where the money's going in, who it's being paid out to, and all the people who are involved in that value chain. I mean, we talked about doing this as a studio. How many people do we have now? Almost 10, 12?
Mm-hmm.
Probably can get bigger soon. So even the socially responsible thing to do would be to track all the money going in and out and knowing precisely who it's being paid out to. I think the concept of doing that at scale at a corporation of, tens of thousands of people is going to make some people a bit queasy, you know? But I think it's like, we talk about like big tobacco or big industry, being able to know the people that are both benefiting from this sort of movement and also the people who are suffering because of it. And we're suffering as a planet. Seeing all that on an open scoreboard, I feel like we bring a lot of clarity to the decisions that we're making to either work for those organizations or support them with our bottom dollar.
Mm. Yeah, aho to that. And so it sounds like what is being named here is this system by which organizations can launch an initiative and or a commitment, some sort of environmental commitment or social commitment, which they currently already do today, right? Like, oh, we're going to be net negative by like 2030, but actually launching an initiative on chain, time stamped, non changeable, publicly viewable, and actually investing some funds into that to put behind this commitment so that if that commitment is not met, those funds will be dispersed to some other place. And all activity that affects that commitment at the company level is tracked and viewable and understood by consumers. And I feel like this type of system actually changes the role from merely being a consumer of a product to being an active participant in this economic system and an active participant in how companies shape their practices and which companies we collectively support. Because my theory is that if this information was publicly available and there were people paying attention to this, it would drastically impact which companies people choose to support.
Yeah,
So,
and I think where the big innovation comes is when we make something that used to be normal very strange, right? Like take Uber for example. You get into a cab nowadays if you're living in the first world, it's kind of weird. It's like you got to call the cab and it rocks up. You don't know if they're coming or not. It's raining. Nothing's tracked on app. You hop in. You're like, what is this? It kind of smells bad. You don't know the guy. Is it safe? There's no ratings, right? If I lose my phone in the car, I can't call nobody. Versus an Uber, it's like you can track everything in the app, right? You know precisely this guy's name. You know his name. You know his rating system. You can message him. You can call him, right? And to me, the cab has become a bit strange, right? And I feel like we need to make the same shift when it comes to corporate commitments, right? Where right now the way it works is some boardroom, you've no access to those conversations. You've no access to any of the context that led to those conversations. Everything is confidential and internal. And then they have a press release. And it is the most dressed up, beautiful version crafted by the best copywriters in the world to make you feel like you're doing good by supporting this corporation. And we say, yay, Coca-Cola, yay, McDonald's, right? Versus we need something where you make a commitment, it's put on chain, there's money behind it, right? The money doesn't go into the PR or it's the marketing campaign that gives them brand and gives them clout. It actually goes into putting the money behind the initiative and then paying that initiative money out to the people impact if and when it is not accomplished, right? We need to make the old way of doing things very strange and basically tell anybody who launches any corporate initiative to go fuck themselves if it is not tracked on chain. It has to be that weird. Like I literally considered not traveling to Italy because they don't have Uber, right? Like I would literally consider not supporting this company because the initiatives that they claim to be part of are not tracked on chain. We need to bring it to that level of severity and pop this bubble that has become this sort of way that our corporations choose to dress themselves up for the public, right? There is not much material substance behind them, and maybe some corporations doing good. Maybe there's some corporations out there with a 100% track record and knock it out of the park. I'm going to guess that's not the case, but right now there's no way to prove that. And what happens is that you read the headlines of some article saying Coca-Cola is committed to blah, blah, blah. And you're like, wow, go Coca-Cola. And you're X percent more likely to buy at the next stop versus being able to follow up on that. And this is the funny thing. Like the people who really care about the shit are get into it. The crypto nerds who are into this stuff, they get into it. And it comes down to the financial incentive, right? Like you stand to gain some sort of financial incentive by really paying close attention to it. And when it's up in an open way that people can see, you will have these geniuses who build dashboards to better analyze, right? Like you could, in theory, if Nike was to do this and Adidas adopts similar technology and Puma and Skechers, whoever, you could literally see at the corporate level a race to the bottom in terms of removing plastic from shoe production, for example. These are the kind of things that happen when we take all this information out of these proprietary databases and put them in a place that people can interact and see what the fuck is going on in our world.
yeah, and I think that points to a significant shift in how capitalism is conducted, in that right now a big focus is on maximizing shareholder value, right? And that's a big purpose, a corporation, a big driving factor of capitalism, maximizing shareholder value. In this model that we are naming right now, that matches up maximizing shareholder value with maximizing positive environmental like practices, right? Because and that is assuming that when this information is publicly available, people will make more informed purchasing decisions, hence impacting the bottom line of an organization and impacting that shareholder value,
And
aligning those two things.
how about being a shareholder of the earth? You know, like talk about being a shareholder. Like it is literally the thing that is responsible for everything that we have. All the materials you see around you, those came from the earth, right? Like you're just stardust. We are all stardust, and we have a limited amount of stardust that we can take and turn into other things. So having a way to represent our shared value system and literally the shares that we hold, which is every material in your hand, in your ears, in your pockets right now, that is the shareholding that we should be paying attention to.
I think that's a great place to leave it at. Earth share.
Yeah, be a good shareholder of Earth. Yeah, I mean, I think there's really something to this. I think we should continue diving into this at a future time. But
I
anyway,
agree.
I appreciate you all. Have a good one.
Peace.